At 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, billionaire Maxwell Sterling watched in horror as his 4-month-old son, Gabriel's lips began turning a frightening shade of blue. The infant had been screaming for over 3 hours straight, his tiny body convulsing with each desperate cry. But now something far worse was happening. Gabriel's breathing had become shallow and ragged, his chest barely rising and falling as oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling around them. Panic spread through the first-class cabin like wildfire as passengers fumbled with their phones, some filming the unfolding crisis, others calling for help. But while chaos erupted around them, one person remained eerily calm. In the very last row of economy class, a young black woman in a wrinkled janitor's uniform slowly stood up, her trained eyes already assessing the situation with the precision of someone who had seen life and death before. Maxwell Sterling had never imagined he would be in this position. Just 6 months ago, he was living the perfect billionaire's life with his beloved wife Catherine and their newborn son. His pharmaceutical empire had made him one of the wealthiest men in America, and everything seemed golden. But a devastating car accident had stolen Catherine away, leaving Maxwell alone with a baby he barely knew how to hold, let alone care for. The grief had consumed him so completely that he had thrown himself back into work, leaving Gabriel's care mostly to a rotating staff of nannies. Today's flight to London was supposed to be a simple business trip, but his usual nanny had quit that morning, forcing Maxwell to bring Gabriel along on what was turning into a nightmare. The flight had started routinely enough. Maxwell had boarded the commercial aircraft with his usual entourage after his private jet developed mechanical problems at the last minute. He wasn't used to flying with ordinary people, and the inconvenience showed in his impatient sighs and sharp words to the flight crew. Gabriel had seemed fussy from the start, but Maxwell had assumed it was normal baby behavior. He tried everything his departed wife had shown him: bottles, pacifiers, gentle rocking, but nothing seemed to work. The crying only intensified as the hours passed, growing more shrill and desperate with each passing minute. Meanwhile, in the cramped economy section, Ruby Johnson tried to ignore the judgmental stares from other passengers. At 28, she looked younger than her years, but her eyes held the weight of someone who had seen too much too early. She wore the navy blue uniform of citywide cleaning services, the logo faded from countless washings. Her shift at Metropolitan Hospital had ended at 6 that morning, but she had taken a double to earn the extra money she desperately needed. The flight to London wasn't for vacation or business, it was to see her dying grandmother, the woman who had raised her after her parents died in a house fire when she was 12. The ticket had cost her last $200, money she couldn't afford to spend, but she couldn't bear the thought of her grandmother dying alone. Ruby had been studying a borrowed medical textbook when the baby's cries first caught her attention. Her trained ear immediately recognized something was wrong. This wasn't ordinary fussiness, this was distress. Years of military medical training had taught her to distinguish between different types of infant cries, and what she was hearing made her stomach clench with worry. She watched from her distant seat as the situation in first class grew more desperate, her instincts screaming at her to help, but her past experiences with wealthy white people held her back. The breaking point came when baby Gabriel's breathing became visibly labored. Ruby could see from her seat that the infant was struggling, his tiny chest working too hard with each breath. She stood up and began walking toward first class, but was immediately intercepted by Kane, Maxwell's hulking bodyguard. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat immediately," Kane said, his voice dripping with disdain as he looked at her uniform. "Mr. Sterling doesn't need assistance from—" He paused, his eyes scanning her from head to toe with obvious prejudice. "The help." The word stung, but Ruby had heard worse. She tried to explain that she had medical training, but Kane physically blocked her path. Other first-class passengers turned to stare, some snickering at the scene. A woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and diamonds dripping from her ears, later identified as socialite Veronica Ashworth, loudly proclaimed, "This is exactly why I usually fly private. You let these people on planes and they think they can go anywhere they want." She held up her phone, recording Ruby's humiliation for her social media followers. Defeated and embarrassed, Ruby retreated to her seat, but she couldn't stop watching. Her medical training wouldn't let her look away, not when a baby's life was potentially at stake. She saw Maxwell growing more frantic by the minute, sweat beading on his forehead as he bounced Gabriel ineffectively. The flight attendants hovered nearby, offering suggestions that clearly weren't working. Other passengers were growing increasingly annoyed by the constant crying, their muttered complaints growing louder and more hostile. Then everything changed in an instant. Baby Gabriel's crying suddenly stopped, but not in a good way. His lips were turning blue, his breathing became extremely shallow, and his tiny body went limp in his father's arms. Maxwell's face went white with terror as he realized something was seriously wrong. "Help!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Something's wrong with my son!" The flight attendants rushed over, but they were clearly out of their depth. One of them grabbed the intercom and made an announcement, asking if there were any medical professionals on board. Ruby didn't hesitate this time. She pushed past startled passengers and strode directly toward first class, ignoring Kane's protests. "Sir, I'm trained in emergency medicine," she said firmly to Maxwell, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Your baby needs immediate help, and I can provide it." Maxwell looked at her uniform, then at his dying son, then back at her face. In her eyes, he saw something that gave him hope, competence, confidence, and genuine concern. "Please," Maxwell whispered, his voice breaking. "Please help him." Ruby immediately took Gabriel from his father's trembling arms and began a rapid assessment. Her military training kicked in as she checked the baby's pulse, breathing, and coloring. What she found confirmed her worst fears. Gabriel had a pneumothorax, a collapsed lung that was preventing him from breathing properly. It was a medical emergency that could be fatal within minutes if not treated immediately. "He has a collapsed lung," Ruby announced to the stunned cabin. "I need to perform an emergency procedure to save his life." She looked directly at Maxwell. "Do you trust me?" The billionaire, faced with his worst nightmare, nodded without hesitation. Ruby immediately began improvising with the limited supplies available on the aircraft. She asked the flight attendants to bring her a large syringe from the medical kit, antiseptic, and anything she could use as a chest tube. Working with steady hands despite the severe turbulence that had begun rocking the plane, Ruby located the correct anatomical landmarks on Gabriel's tiny chest. She had performed this procedure dozens of times during her military service in combat zones, but never on someone so small and never at 30,000 feet. The entire cabin fell silent except for the hum of the engines and the occasional gasp from onlookers. Even Veronica Ashworth had stopped her commentary, watching in fascination as this janitor demonstrated medical skills that rivaled any emergency room doctor. Ruby inserted the improvised chest tube with precision that spoke of extensive training and experience. Almost immediately, Gabriel's breathing improved dramatically. Color returned to his lips, his chest began rising and falling normally, and after a few tense moments, he even let out a small cry that sounded like music to everyone's ears. The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause, but Ruby remained focused, monitoring Gabriel's vital signs and ensuring the procedure was successful. As Gabriel stabilized in her arms, Ruby began to explain what had happened. "Pneumothorax in infants can be caused by several factors," she said, her voice steady and professional. "Sometimes it's congenital, sometimes it's caused by respiratory distress. The important thing is that he's going to be fine now, but he needs to see a pediatric surgeon as soon as we land." Maxwell stared at her in amazement, unable to comprehend how this woman he had initially ignored had just saved his son's life. The revelation of Ruby's background came gradually. She explained that she had been a decorated medic in the Army, serving 3 tours in Afghanistan where she had saved countless lives under the most challenging conditions imaginable. She had specialized in emergency pediatric care and had been recognized with multiple commendations for her service. But her military career had ended abruptly when she discovered that a pharmaceutical company was supplying faulty medications to field hospitals, medications that were causing serious adverse reactions in wounded soldiers. When Ruby tried to report the problem through proper channels, she was met with resistance and eventually retaliation. The pharmaceutical company had powerful connections in the military hierarchy, and rather than investigating her claims, the Army chose to discharge her and revoke her medical credentials. Unable to practice medicine and blacklisted from most medical facilities, Ruby had been forced to take whatever work she could find. Cleaning hospitals was the closest she could get to the medical field she loved, and she used every opportunity to stay current with medical literature and procedures. Maxwell listened to her story with growing horror and admiration. Here was a woman who had dedicated her life to saving others, only to be destroyed by a corrupt system for trying to do the right thing. And now she had saved his most precious possession while asking for nothing in return. He found himself looking at Ruby with new eyes, seeing not a janitor in a wrinkled uniform, but a hero who had been hiding in plain sight. The plane began its descent into London, and paramedics were waiting on the ground to transport Gabriel to the nearest children's hospital. As they prepared for landing, Maxwell learned more about Ruby's current situation. She was flying to see her grandmother, who was dying of cancer in a London hospital. The elderly woman had raised Ruby after her parents' death and had worked multiple jobs to put her granddaughter through school and support her dream of becoming a doctor. Now, in her final days, she was alone except for Ruby, who had scraped together her last $200 for this trip. The irony wasn't lost on Maxwell when he discovered which pharmaceutical company had been responsible for the faulty medications that ended Ruby's career. Sterling Pharmaceuticals, his own company, had been the supplier in question. The revelation hit him like a physical blow, making him realize that his own corporation had destroyed the life of the woman who had just saved his son. The weight of that knowledge was crushing, but it also presented him with an opportunity to make things right. As the plane touched down and paramedics boarded to check Gabriel, Maxwell made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He publicly apologized to Ruby in front of all the passengers, acknowledging that his company had wronged her and promising to make amends. Veronica Ashworth, who had been filming the entire encounter for her social media accounts, suddenly found herself on the wrong side of public opinion as her earlier cruel comments went viral for all the wrong reasons. Within weeks of returning to the United States, Maxwell had mobilized his legal team to investigate Ruby's case thoroughly. What they found was even worse than he had imagined: a systematic cover-up that had protected Sterling Pharmaceuticals at the cost of a decorated veteran's career and reputation. Maxwell took full responsibility for his company's actions, cooperating with federal investigators and ensuring that everyone involved in the cover-up was held accountable. More importantly, he worked tirelessly to restore Ruby's medical credentials and reputation. The process took months of legal battles and bureaucratic red tape, but Maxwell used every resource at his disposal to clear her name. He also established a foundation to help other veterans who had been wrongly discharged or faced similar retaliation for whistleblowing. The transformation was remarkable. Ruby Johnson, who had been cleaning floors just months before, was reinstated as Dr. Ruby Johnson and offered the position of Chief Medical Officer at Sterling Pharmaceuticals. Her first initiative was to establish comprehensive oversight procedures to ensure that the company's medications met the highest safety standards and that any safety concerns would be investigated immediately and transparently. Meanwhile, Veronica Ashworth found herself on the receiving end of social media justice. Her cruel videos from the flight went viral, but not in the way she had intended. Public outrage over her behavior was swift and merciless, leading to her being dropped by sponsors and ostracized from her social circle. In a twist of poetic justice, she eventually found work at the same hospital where Ruby had once cleaned floors, finally learning the value of honest work and humility. The story of that flight became a powerful reminder that heroes don't always wear capes or carry impressive titles. Sometimes they wear janitor's uniforms and sit in the back of planes, quietly carrying the skills and courage needed to save lives. Ruby's journey from decorated veteran to wrongly disgraced whistleblower to life-saving hero to respected medical executive showed that true worth isn't measured by current circumstances but by character, courage, and the willingness to do what's right regardless of the cost. For Maxwell, the experience fundamentally changed how he viewed the world and his place in it. He had learned that privilege and wealth could blind him to the true value of people around him, and that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. His son Gabriel, now healthy and thriving, would grow up knowing the story of the brave woman who saved his life and the importance of judging people by their actions rather than their appearances. The moral of their story resonated far beyond that single flight, reminding everyone who heard it that we are all connected by our common humanity and that the person sitting in the last row of the plane might just be the hero you never knew you needed.